Robert Jenrick, hello.
Hello, very nice to be here.
You know who was sat in that seat recently? Keir Starmer.
Ah.
So, yeah, we could maybe have two prime ministers in a row sitting in that seat, depending on how things go for your party. Anyway, right, we've got loads to talk about and we've got plenty of time, and it's a podcast, so we can just have a chat rather than it being like, pow, 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 pow. What was your earliest political memory?
Good question.
This is like the psychiatrist
It feels a bit like that, doesn't it? I do remember sitting up watching the 1992 general election results with my mum and dad when I was 10, I think.
Wow.
At that point. So I do remember watching that. And
what's your actual memory of that? Can you picture yourself like in the living room?
I can picture myself on the sofa at home watching that, and we watched the exit poll, and then obviously stayed up a bit later and later and later, and it all started to change over the course of the night. Although my dad was a Labour voter. I think my mum had voted Conservative, but my dad was a Labour voter, so there were mixed emotions.
Yeah, what was the vibe on the sofa like that? Yeah,
and this was not a true blue household, so it was.
And presumably at that point, you were too young to like know which kind of side you were on.
Yeah, no, I didn't. No, I didn't feel like I had any sort of skin in the game at that point. But the excitement, I guess, I remember of the fact that it was a very, very close and unpredictable election in which pundits and pollsters were wrong.
And then fast forward 5 years from there to 1997, and am I right that you joined the Conservative Party the day after the election?
No, it wasn't quite.
Or
it
around
wasn't
that
quite
time.
the day
It wasn't as
after.
poetic as that.
I mean, I wish that were. I do wish that was
In
the
Robert
case.
Jenrick, the movie, that's what was happening.
It was a little bit later than that. There was, I think, William Hague, from memory, came on a sort of listening to Britain tour, and he went around to some of the constituencies that had been lost, and I was in Wolverhampton, which was not like a very strong Conservative place by any means, but it had been a Conservative constituency, and so he came and did a sort of event there, and so I went along with a friend of mine to go and listen to him. I mean, we were the only young Conservatives in the audience, it has to be said. Not a lot has changed in that respect, but we went to listen to him. I think I joined the Conservative Party either then or within a couple of weeks of that.
Well, because it would have been very unfashionable to do that at that time.
It was deeply unfashionable, yeah. No, there were not many Conservatives in Wolverhampton in 1997, let alone 16-year-old Conservatives. So I was definitely an outlier in that respect. But
And what was it as a 16-year-old, or in that period between 92 and 97, that had convinced you that you were Conservative?
I think it was, although my parents were not Conservative voters, not uniformly, and they were certainly not members of any political party, they did instill in me what I would now describe as very Conservative values. They were both basically working class people from Manchester and Liverpool. They'd left school at a very young age, 16. My dad'd been an apprentice. My mum became a secretary at Littlewoods, which was then one of the big employers in Liverpool. They moved to the Black Country in the 70s. My dad worked in a kind of classic Black Country business, a big industrial iron foundry. And that was a business that was really decimated by the 70s. Poor management, out of control trade unions, British industry going from places like Birmingham and Wolverhampton. And then I think inspired by the sort of culture that emerged in the early 80s, they both quit their jobs, set up a small business around our kitchen table, which had a lot of ups and downs. I mean, more downs than ups during that time. It did not prosper quickly. But they did instill in me, I think, hard work, belief in small business. They were very aspirational by nature, and they loved family. You know, buying a home, that was, even when money was tight, the home was really everything. We were a real nuclear family. And their roots were in what you described today as pretty traditional, patriotic, working class families. And so collectively, I think that gave me what I would describe as my Conservative values today. They're the values that I still have. And my politics, although, I've gone on to be very lucky in life in going to university, working in professions like the law, going into politics, my politics are still very much rooted in my 16-year-old self, in the sense of small towns. I represent a small town in North Nottinghamshire today. Those are the people that I try to represent, really.
Not to get too pretentious, and we will let you do your leadership pitch in a second, but that point you made about deindustrialization, some people listening to that will say, oh, the union strife in the 70s was only half the story. The person who finished it off was Margaret Thatcher. Would you agree with that? Those factories didn't just close because of the Labour government in the 70s.
Well, I think it wasn't just the Labour government, incidentally. I mean, I think the whole post-war consensus ultimately failed. It was an economic model that didn't work. The country was uncompetitive. That's why I say there was bad management as much as there was out of control trade unions. We were in an economy that was on its knees in the 70s. And I mean, I think Margaret Thatcher ultimately saved the country from that. And in fact, my dad today, who never voted for Margaret Thatcher, would be the first to say that the medicine was hard and it felt tough at the time, particularly if you were working in those businesses, living in those communities. But it ultimately turned the country around. Now, that prosperity was not shared evenly across the country, and some places found it much more difficult, including a part of the world like Nottinghamshire, where I represent today. There was a lot of difficulties, a lot of social problems that arose out of in Nottinghamshire, the end of mining over the course of the 80s and the 90s. But it did in the end instill an enterprise culture, a competitive edge in the country, which we just simply didn't have in the 1970s. And so I always feel that Margaret Thatcher was a great success for this country.
Continuing with your thought about your own sort of political journey, your own political awakening, at what point did you think, oh, you know what, one day I'd like to be an MP? When did that thought? Was that when you were listening to William Hague, or did that come later? I'm just intrigued.
I think the young Rob probably would have aspired to be a member of Parliament. But it wasn't like an obsession. I mean, I didn't go to the Conservative Party conference like William Hague and give a speech when I was 16. I mean, it was many, many years later. I think I was in my mid-20s. It was a 2005 party conference, in fact, where David Cameron did his sort of memorable speech. Was the first one that I ever went to. So it was a much slower process of trying to, work my way into politics. And I never worked in politics. I mean, I was never a special advisor. I wasn't a councillor. I went off and had a career. I was elected at a young age. I was elected at 31, so I was the youngest Conservative MP at the time. But it took a lot longer before I decided, you know what, I'd actually like to do this, and this is the best way that I can make a contribution.
Do you remember that by-election campaign for Newark in 2014 when Chris and you were live on the BBC News channel, and Chris got you to live value an antique teapot in reference to your job for an auction house? I remember it clearly.
I had completely forgotten about that, but now that memory does.
Was it a genuine antique, or was it just
So what it was?
Explain yourself.
Well, because and Robert will tell me if I'm misrepresenting this part of his biography, but you worked for Christie's, didn't you?
I did,
Prior to running for Parliament. And we latched onto the idea, and I think somebody else had actually done it as well, so I don't claim to be necessarily original at this. We latched onto the idea of buying something from Newark Market and then asking an expert to value it. And so I bought this kind of beaker thing for a couple of quid. And then there we were on the BBC News channel or Daily Politics. Or whatever.
And did I get it right?
I think you did actually, or fairly close.
I didn't claim it was, a mice and teapot.
No, exactly. Because I thought you could either say it was the 17th century and it was priceless, or say that it was a complete load of rubbish or whatever. And I could say, I've bought it from your local market. You didn't fall for either of those two potential.
No. Well, I am a bit of a demon in bric-a-brac. And
are you?
Both my wife and I like that. We're definitely jumble sale, bric-a-brac.
What was the last thing you bought in that format?
I bought a Churchill Toby jug from the 1940s.
How much was that?
It's like £100.
What?
Yeah.
Okay.
They're quite valuable, actually.
So do you basically go around antiquing at the weekends? That's like
I do occasionally, not so much lately, but I do occasionally. And Newark that was one of its sort of heritage. My constituency, that was one of its sort of heritages was bric-a-brac and antiques and things.
So is the house full of junk then? Have you got all this
junk?
Well, that's a harsh.
I don't mean
one man's junk is another man's treasure.
I don't mean the Churchill thing. I just mean the bric-a-brac thing.
We have quite a lot of stuff.
Right.
Yeah. No, I think we don't need any more. That's for sure.
Right.
Not to fixate on the Churchill Toby jug, but would you ever drink the mug? Would you ever drink from that, or is it like for display purposes?
Yeah, that's just for display purposes. But
Just check. Right, let's bring it right before we turn into Antiques Roadshow, the podcast. Let's get right up to date now. So, if you win this contest and you'll be leader of the opposition, like, what's your kind of model for doing that job? Like, just give us some of the principles that you would have in your head when you are the leader of the opposition, if that's the outcome.
well, look, the pitch that I've had over the course of the summer is that the Conservative Party needs to change. You know, you can't lose your worst ever electoral defeat like we just did. I mean, the worst since the 1830s. I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg tells me it's the 1760s, and he probably knows.
It really is the Antiques Roadshow, this podcast.
You know, you can't go down to that kind of defeat and not completely change the operation of the Conservative Party, the offer to the public. And so I have tried to be painfully honest about some of the mistakes that we've made on the NHS, on the economy, in particular on immigration. And I've also sought to bring forward actual specific policies where I think we could change as a party and begin to rebuild the public's trust. Because I think the public are deeply sceptical about my party right now. And that's born out of my own experience. I'm literally the only Conservative Member of Parliament in the whole of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. And I credit my success in managing to hold my seat really to the positions that I took, sometimes at variance with the party in recent years. So I think you have to be painfully honest. You have to listen to the public in this situation. And you've got to come forward with some policies that can slowly rebuild people's trust and confidence in my party. And I do think that begins with migration, not because I'm obsessed by it. Some people in the media say I'm banging on about it, but because it's the foundation of the party coming back. Because if we can't win back the 4 million voters that we lost to reform, there's no path to us being in government. We won't get a hearing on all the other things that we care about, like education, the health service, the environment, all the other policies that I personally am interested in and want the Conservative Party to be serious on. But it begins with winning back those reform voters and reuniting the Conservative family.
I'm intrigued about how your views have changed since you've been an MP, particularly your time in the Home Office. There was a you probably saw this yesterday, critique from Dan Hodges in the Mail on Sunday.
Oh, he's
where
not
he
a
says,
fan.
Where he was effectively saying sort of who is the real Robert Jenrick. Equally, I speak to folk who have worked in the Home Office under both Conservative governments and Labour governments who almost universally say no one comes out of the Home Office more left-wing than they went in. In other words, they see problems with systems, particularly around migration, and come to the view that there needs to be significant change. Talk to our audience about how your experience in government changed your views, particularly on migration.
Yes. Well, I'd like to think my values haven't changed. They are rooted in my upbringing, and I've always cared about keeping the public safe, having secure borders. Most people do. But it's undoubtedly true that I arrived in the Home Office and was absolutely shocked by some of the things that I saw. And I think probably more than previous ministers, I made an effort to go and see the people who are actually on the front line of this. Because most of us are not really on the front line of immigration. It's not our kids who are struggling to get on the housing ladder, the social housing waiting list. It's not the hotel next to our house that's been used for illegal immigrants. And so I did go. And in fact, the first week I was minister, I went against the advice of the officials to Dover at the invitation of the local MP to go and meet people who lived on the council estate just above the cliffs in Dover.
The advice
what was their argument for not going?
I think they thought that it would end badly. There would be media people. This would be a bad news story, which in one sense, it was a bad news story, wasn't it?
So they were trying to protect your reputation.
They were
as a
trying
minister.
to
It's not like
protect
some
me.
kind of institutional bias against.
No, they just thought.
People.
But it was in a sense because it was born out of a lack of interest, I would argue, in the actual consequences for normal people of our immigration system. And so I went and sat in the kitchen of someone a pensioner who'd woken up one morning and had somebody who'd literally come off a boat. In those days, the boats were landing on our shores. Today, they're almost always met at sea. And she'd found somebody in her kitchen who was rummaging through the fridge because they were hungry and were just about to try and go off and make a life in the UK. I met their next door neighbour who was a pregnant woman who'd had a similar story, and she'd found somebody in her bedroom when she woke up one day. And these people were genuinely scared and terrified about the experiences they'd had. About a week later, there was a riot at a hotel in Knowsley, and I made the time to go and talk to some of the residents there, and the very good Labour MP, George Howarth, who had been dealing with this in a very sensitive way. And some of the officials in the department were, they said, well, this is just a sort of rundown hotel, and it's sort of natural that we would use this hotel for migrants. But when you talk to the residents, this was firstly, I think, the only hotel in that part of Knowsley, and it was where, the couple I chatted to, it was where their golden wedding anniversary had been held. It was somebody else had their wedding cancelled because we'd taken over this hotel. And I could give you many, many more examples. And frankly, examples much more concerning than this. Somebody who had been murdered in Hartlepool, or the family of somebody who had died in Bournemouth when a man posed as a child and then went on to kill someone. And I think these experiences did have an impact on me, because I came to the conclusion that, firstly, the British state was basically broken. We were unable to do such basic things like get a terrorist out of our country because of various human rights laws, or to manage these large numbers of people coming in. But also there was a sort of casual disregard by politicians of all political persuasions, by a lot of the media as well, in Westminster, about the true consequence of this on our society. And that had to change.
So, I mean, that's a very striking phrase about the British state being broken. Was it broken by the Conservative government?
Well, we had contributed to it, but the roots are deeper than that. It's on migration. I would argue that probably since the 90s, politicians had made a series of promises at every election because they knew that's what the public broadly wanted. But then as soon as they were in office, would do precisely the opposite. And our party shares the blame for that, perhaps more than any other, because it was Conservatives who led the charge in the Brexit referendum, where most people were motivated by a desire to see controlled and reduced immigration. That's legal migration. And then we even put on the podium, stop the boats. But we were not ultimately willing to do what was necessary to actually change things. And as the front man for that policy for a year, I gradually came to the view that I wasn't prepared to just be another minister who made and broke promises, that treated the public in that way, and that we had to do something fundamentally different.
We see some people, don't we, describe the arrival of people in small boats as amounting to an invasion. Is that a word you would use?
Well, it's not a phrase that I used at the time. It was used by Suella Braverman, who was the Home Secretary. But I don't think it's a phrase that is out of step with what many people in our country would say themselves. And there's a duty upon politicians to choose their words with care and find subtlety in language. But there is also a duty to speak for the people you serve. And the more I spoke to members of the public about some of these issues, the more it became obvious to me that most people are very angry about the way that their politicians have treated them on these issues. And my own language became stronger with every passing month, and to an extent still does.
Is it an invasion?
I don't think that's a completely inaccurate phase, because we've had over 130,000 people enter our country in flagrant abuse of our laws, who are now living amongst us, costing vast sums of money. Some of these people are genuine refugees, some are not. Most are economic migrants. Almost all are just coming from a place of evident safety, like France. These are not the people that the UK would seek to help if it had its own way. We would get people directly from refugee camps, wouldn't we, in Syria or Afghanistan or places like that. We would seek to help families, not predominantly young men who are able to pay a people smuggler. So I do think that whilst I always try to persuade rather than needlessly provoke, there is a duty on politicians to understand, appreciate the scale of anger and frustration there is in the country, or else we will see people who are feeling that they are just completely ignored and unlistened to, and that contributes to things like the riots and the discontent that we saw across the country earlier this year.
But haven't you just given a very classic politician's answer to that question about whether it's an invasion or not? Because you want people to hear you saying, "Oh, it's not an inaccurate way to describe it," but then you won't use the word yourself. So you're trying to say
it's not
trying to say it and
not
not
really.
say it at the
It's
same
not the
time.
turn of phrase that I would use.
Yeah.
But I do say that these people are breaking into our country in flagrant abuse of our laws. I don't see how you can diminish that. And I don't scold people who use those words, because I think that is a turn of phrase that millions of people across our country would say. And you only have to knock on doors in my constituency to speak to people who feel deeply angry at the way in which politicians have behaved on this, and are looking for people who've got the guts and the political courage to tackle this issue. And that is what I've sought to do in recent months and years.
So one of your big solutions to that then would be withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights. I mean, that is the basis of the human rights law in this country. Obviously, we've written our own version in the Human Rights Act. So what do you replace that current structure of human rights with?
Well, firstly, I don't think it's the basis of our human rights in this country. We had human rights long before the ECHR. We're, after all, the country of Magna Carta and habeas corpus. You know, we gave the ECHR to other European countries primarily to help protect them from the horrors of the Holocaust and the Second World War, because we felt that we had strong protections in this country that had stood the test of time. But I would like to replace it with a British Bill of Rights. And there are many great lawyers like Lord Jonathan Sumption, who I think could be part of drafting something that could be a beacon to democracies and aspirant democracies around the world. I just don't think that it's working at the moment. You know, I'll give you an example from a couple of weeks ago. There was a Ugandan man who had clubbed somebody to death in the back of an ambulance in North London. He was going to be deported back home. The court said, under the guise of the ECHR, that couldn't happen because Uganda couldn't guarantee his mental health. And the judge used the right to a family life in the UK. But I mean, that was never designed for that instance, was it? It was designed thinking of Stalinist Russia or the Holocaust. The ECHR has been twisted out of all possible connection with its original noble objections. So I want to change that.
So would the British Bill of Rights that you would introduce then be human rights that applied only to people who were born in this country?
Well, that would be a decision for Parliament. I would be inclined to hive out a lot of our immigration law from that so that we're enabled to secure our borders. But the key difference is that ultimately Parliament would be in the driving seat. And so if there was an issue of the day that was felt to be critical to our national interest, like, say, whether or not we should give an amnesty to British servicemen and women who'd served somewhere like Northern Ireland, or whether it was trying to get a policy like Rwanda off the ground, our Parliament, our democratically elected members of Parliament, could ultimately choose to pass a law which would then be able to be effective rather than finding a foreign court overruling it at the last minute.
Do you hope Donald Trump wins the US election?
Well, I've been asked this question before. I am a conservative. I lean towards Republican candidates. That is a natural thing to do. And I think there's, some good qualities in the things that he and his campaign have argued for, not least on immigration. I do not support everything that Donald Trump has said and done. Of course I don't. And if I was lucky enough to lead this party in 2 weeks' time, I would work with whoever is president of the United States and seek to have the most constructive relationship.
That's kind of sitting on the fence, isn't it? I mean, some Conservatives have said that whilst they would normally, naturally be inclined towards backing a Republican, they wouldn't be able to back Donald Trump. If you had a vote, would you vote for him?
Well, I don't have a vote, do I?
Well, no, I know. I'm asking you a hypothetical. But
well, the first thing you learn in politics is not to answer hypothetical questions, Chris. But I am a conservative. I naturally lean towards Republican candidates. So I'm not going to distance myself from Republican candidates. However, do I agree with everything that Donald Trump says? No, of course I don't.
Did your paths cross with Ivanka Trump at university in Pennsylvania? I just noticed you. It looks like you were there at the same time.
We were. I didn't. I mean, I knew her, but we were not friends. But she was certainly a big character on campus at the time, because that was the heyday of The Apprentice in America, and so she was the celebrity on campus.
Did you talk to her about politics?
No, I don't remember talking to her about politics. But I did meet her, and she seemed like a very nice person. But she was being mobbed at the time because her dad was the TV superstar long before he decided to go into politics.
And did you go to Trump's inauguration?
I did go to that, more out of curiosity than anything. I'm very interested in American politics, and so I went along to it. And
are you going to go to the next inauguration next year?
Well, I don't know if I'll be invited to that, but my general view is that the US is our greatest ally in the world, and that whoever is leader of our party, or indeed prime minister of our country, should try to build the deepest and most productive relationship with their counterparts in the US.
Are you the underdog in this race?
Probably. I mean, I've been the underdog throughout. If we had done this interview 3 or 4 months ago, the odds were 66-1. Today, it's neck and neck. I think there's...
Do you think it is neck and neck?
I do. I mean, I've done more events than...
Oh, so you're not the underdog then?
Well, I think I'm not the establishment candidate, that's for certain. Who would the Conservative Party establishment like to win? Well, probably not me, because I've set out a pretty blunt diagnosis of what's gone wrong.
You know Kemi Badenoch better than us. If you accused her of that to her face of being the establishment candidate, she'd be furious, wouldn't she?
Well, I think it's just a statement of fact, isn't it? Look at the people who are supporting her today. I don't have the backing of your Michael Goves and so on of this. Well, they're supporting her. What is the point of difference between us? I think it's quite clear that I have set out a really strong diagnosis of what's gone wrong. I have set out very clear policies which would mark a big change for the party from its recent past. We just talked about one with respect to leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, which she is not willing to commit to. And our approach to this campaign has been very different. I have adopted one where I've put myself up for a lot of scrutiny in the media. I've travelled around the country meeting a lot of members, listening to their actual views. And I've set out a very clear policy platform, because I think that the public do not want policy-free politicians. I think the public are yearning for politicians who speak the truth, lay out trade-offs on these difficult issues, and are willing to be very clear about where they stand. And what has marked the Conservative Party in recent years has been drama and excuses for failure. I'm not prepared to perpetuate that. I think the way to unite the Conservative Party is to stand on a very clear policy platform, and then ask the party to come back together, unite around those policies. I think anything else is a recipe for more infighting, more division, even more loss of public trust.
The Daily Express was reporting over the weekend that there was an event cancelled in Gravesend in Kent due to a lack of interest. Is that right?
Not as far as I'm aware. We did a big event yesterday at Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, and then we did a Connect calling where we were chatting to people on the telephones last night. So I've done more events than than anyone who stood in this contest. I think sometimes multiples, 2, 3, 4 times more events than some of the other candidates. I'm the only one who's been to all 4 nations of the UK. I have gone to, I think it's fair, I think most people would accept, a big effort to listen to the membership of this party, because we've got to get them back together again. I want the Conservative family to get back going. I want to get the party back on the road.
And I should say, we have invited Kemi Badenoch to come and sit on the Newscast sofa, but she's not found time yet, but there is still time. I'm just thinking, if we were really professional, I'd now whip out that teapot from 2014 and say, "This is your life, Robert Jenrick." Teapot back.
Well, I think I gave it to you at the time. I seem to recall.
I think so.
It's all with all these other jokes to quote you.
It's next to that Churchill pot. That's where it is. I wonder where it had gone. Excuse the spot of sort of archaeology here, but someone brought to my attention that when you were at university, you ran unopposed as to be student president at St John's College, Cambridge, but still didn't
This wasn't
win.
my finest hour, I think.
Oh, right, okay. So tell me, so you ran, there was no other candidates, but you still didn't win. Was that the thrust of it?
Basically, yes.
Right.
But my electoral record has been proved over the years since then, it has to be said.
And also, just full transparency, I ran with my friends to be the entertainment officer at university, and we were unopposed. And actually, typical Oxbridge, like when you're unopposed, they put in this other candidate called Ron, which means reopen nominations. So basically, if you don't want to vote for the person who's the only person on the ballot paper, you can vote for Ron.
So it was Ron versus Rob.
Yeah,
exactly.
And I have to confess, when I did it, Ron came pretty close.
Yeah, I think people didn't like unopposed elections.
Oh, so it was more a comment on elections than you.
Well, I'd like to think that.
I might steal that when I talk about my own limited experience of electoral politics. Robert Jenrick, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. It's been a real pleasure.
Cheers.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.